I'm sure you all recall that His Excellency the President presented the 2023 budget proposal to the joint session of the National Assembly on the 7th of October. And this underscores the administration's commitment to sustain the return to a predictable January to December fiscal year. And I must say that Mr. President also presented the 2022 budget on the 7th of October last year. So I don't know whether the 7th of October is also becoming a tradition, but let's wait and see what happens next. The principal thrust of the 2023 Appropriation Proposal, which we christened the Budget of Fiscal Consolidation and Transition, is to maintain fiscal viability and ensure smooth transition for the incoming administration. This budget proposal has been prepared against the backdrop of continuous global and domestic challenges caused by the multiple crises of the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, more recently the war in Ukraine, but also the continuous fiscal tightening that is being undertaken by the Fed, the Central Bank of the US, which is resulting in hyperinflation across the world. There's also the fact that the global economy itself is weakening. So this is where we are right now, and it's not where we are is a global, a place of global fragility, and Nigeria is part of the global economy. So many economies around the world are currently contending with a lot of fiscal instability, slow growth, food crisis, as well as high interest rates. Like many other countries, our economy faces headwinds from low revenues, high inflation, exchange rate depreciation, as well as insecurity in our case. Factors that are impacting the medium-term outlook include the war between Russia and Ukraine, which has assumed a very new and worrisome dimension, with severe implications on food and energy prices, which have heightened the cost of petroleum subsidy for Nigeria. The resurgence of COVID-19 in some major economies of the world, notably China, has also led to slowdown in economic activities in those countries. Elevated inflation in most economies, prompting monetary tightening in these economies, with the inherent negative impact on capital inflows to emerging markets and developing economies. There's also the challenging domestic macro and business environment and the negative impact of insecurity on the domestic economy. The Nigerian economy, despite all of these challenges, has sustained its recovery from recession, reporting a seventh consecutive quarter of a positive growth of 3.54% in real terms in the second quarter of this year. Most sectors recorded positive growth. The broad-based growth reflects the effective implementation of our economic sustainability measures. So the IMF expects the Nigerian economy to grow by 3.2% in 2022 and 3% in 2023. But as I reported earlier on, just this last week when we came back from the IMF World Bank annual meetings, the global growth has been adjusted down again to 2.73%. There is significant improvements in the Nigerian economy, and we are right to claim that the Nigerian economy is diversified across several sectors, with several sectors of the economy reporting macroeconomic resilience, but with the oil and gas sector contributing only 6.33% of the GDP as at the second quarter of 2022. The greatest contribution to our GDP is still from the agricultural sector at 23%. This is followed by the information and communication sector at 18%. Trade follows at 17%, manufacturing at 9%, and then the oil and gas sector. We have seen between the first quarter 2021 and the 2022 and the second quarter 2022, significant increase in transportation and storage. So the transport sector has grown by 168%. This growth is closely followed by the growth in the electricity, gas and steam sector by 54%, and then the water and supply sector by 46%. There are several sectors that are reporting positive growth, but the oil and gas and the mining sector are continuing to report negative growth at minus 22.02%. The IMF forecasts global growth to slow down from 6.0% in 2021 to 3.2% in 2022. But the IMF also forecasts that 2023 growth will slow down to 2.7%, the weakest growth profile since 2001, except for the global financial crisis and the acute phase of the COVID-19 pandemic. This global economic slowdown is projected to affect all the advanced economies. Growth in the United States has been revised to just 1.6% in 2022 against 2.3% that was projected earlier. And also, it's expected to further taper down to 1% in 2023 in the possibility, and there is also a strong possibility of a recession even in the US. In the Euro area, growth is projected to be 3.1% in 2022, better than what was projected for July, with just 0.5%. But the zone could lapse into recession as well in 2023. China, the world's second largest economy, is expected to experience its worst year in more than 40 years in the year 2022, excluding what they experienced during the COVID, but with the expectation of growth of just 3.2% before recovering slightly to 4.4% in 2023. Global inflation is forecast to rise at 4.7% from 4.7% in 2021 to 8.8% in 2022, but it will begin to taper down to 6.5% in 2023. All of why we report these things they're important because they have a direct impact also on the Nigerian economy. We live in a global world. Next, I want to report on the performance of the current year budget, the 2022 budget. You recall that we set the budget at an oil production of 1.6%. As at July, the average production is 1.26%. The oil price benchmark we had set was appropriated at 73%. The actual price that has been achieved is $110.45 for a barrel. Exchange rates that we had projected to be at 410 naira 15 kobo is currently an average of 424 naira and 48 kobo. So inflation that we projected to be at 16.11% is currently at as at July at 20.77%. But we've just released the CPI report for August, and August is reporting 23.3%. GDP growth that we projected at 3.55%, the actual GDP growth is 3.54%. That is as at second quarter, June 2022. The actual average crude oil price is higher than the benchmark. However, the higher oil prices is offset in the case of Nigeria by low oil output, which as at June is at 1.2 million barrels per day. NNPC attributes this fall in oil production on the high incidence of crude oil theft and pipeline vandalization. But we've also seen recent reports that with increased security operation, that the crude oil production will begin to pick up, and we're tracking the numbers. Exchange rate inflation and GDP growth varied adversely from target. Growth is, however, expected to accelerate given efforts to contain structural issues impacting adversely on the cost of doing business in Nigeria. Let me give you an update of the 2022 budget performance. On revenue, as at August 2022, the federal government retained revenue was 4.23 trillion. This represents 64% of the prorated target for the period. The federal government share of oil revenue was 395.06 billion, representing 27.1% of the prorated target for the period, while non-oil tax revenues total 1.549 trillion, reporting a performance of 102.9%, that is slightly above the target. This performance is largely contributed by company income tax and VAT that are reporting performances of 136.3% above target for the company income tax, and while the VAT is trailing the target at 99.6%. Customs revenue, on the other hand, which is the performance is 83%, that is 17% below target. 17% is 102.51 billion below the target set for customs for prorated to August 2022. Other revenues amounting to 2.19 trillion, of which these are actual collections, of which independent revenue contribution, that is revenue from government-owned enterprises, it is 866.16 billion. On the expenditure performance, the aggregate expenditure for the 2022 budget was set as 17.32 trillion, and if you prorate it to August, it means 11.55 trillion at the end of August. The actual spending as at the end of August is 9.56 trillion. This is about 83% of the prorated target. And of this spending, 3.52 trillion was for debt service, 2.89 trillion was for personnel costs and including pensions, while 1.78 billion was released for capital expenditure. And this is as at August. The fiscal deficit for the 2022 period to August is, for the year, is 7.35 trillion. To August, the prorated target will have been 5.33 trillion. As at August, the deficit is slightly above target by 430.82 billion. The level of borrowing as at August is 1.23 trillion ahead of the July target, ahead of the August target. What we've done is we front-loaded our borrowing to enable us release capital expenditures, capital funding earlier, so that the MDAs will have a longer time in which to implement their programs and projects. So the borrowing has tapered down for the rest of the year. Let me now move to the key assumptions and the macroeconomic framework underlying the 2023 budget proposal. The key parameters, as well as other macro projections driving the medium-term revenue and expenditure framework, have been revised to take into reality the emerging realities. The new figures includes the oil price benchmark of $70 compared to $73 for 2022, while the oil production is 1.69 million barrels per day compared to 1.6 million for 2022. And I'm looking only at the 2023 figures. This presentation will be posted on the website, so you can look at the details. Inflation, which we had set in 2022 at 16.7, we have adjusted upwards to 17.16% at 2023. And we're still holding down to this. Even though inflation is rising, our projection is it will soon plateau and begin to go down. So 2023 is projected to average 17.16%. The non-oil GDP will be 216 trillion, while the oil GDP will be 11.4 trillion. And growth is projected to be at 3.75% compared to 3.5% 5%. I'm sure people will be wondering why we are projecting that the Nigerian economy will grow when the global economy is declining. We still have a couple of strong macroeconomic indicators. And we also have an election that is ongoing. Election actually reflects the economy. Some of the parameters underlying the 2023 projections deviate from the projections in the National Development Plan for 2021 to 2025. And this is so because we have to take into account a combination of the current realities and also a modified outlook that we have been compelled to look at. For instance, while the real GDP is projected to be at 3.75% in 2022, compared to what we had in the development plan at 4.39%. Growth was expected to moderate to 3.3% in 2024 before picking up to 3.4%. So when you compare the budget projections and the National Development Plan, there are a few moderations that we had to make to take into account current realities. Inflation in the National Plan was 14.93%. but we have had to adjust it upwards to 17.16% to conform to the new realities. Sustained upward pressure on prices is expected to be driven by the current lag effect of the global price surge due to the war in Ukraine, also domestic insecurity in our case, and the rising cost of imports, as well as exchange rate depreciation and other supply-side constraints. Growth in nominal consumption has also been adjusted in line with revised estimates based on the components of the GDP and the historical performances. The nominal consumption is projected to be 121.93 trillion for 2023. Investments, especially from foreign sources, are expected to be dragged down by interest rate hikes in advanced economies, foreign exchange management concerns, and other domestic challenges, including insecurity. I'll now move on to the report on the overview of the 2023 budget. The projected fiscal outcome for 2023 is based on a PMS subsidy scenario, which we had presented to FEC and to Parliament, and it was approved. In the 2023 budget, we had assumed that PMS subsidy will remain up to the middle of 2023, based on the 18 months extension that was announced by government early 2022. In this regard, only 3.36 trillion has been provided for PMS subsidy for the year 2023. There will also be tighter enforcement of performance management framework for government-owned enterprises that will significantly increase operating surplus, as well as dividend remittances during the year 2023. So total revenue that will be available to fund the 2023 budget is estimated at 9.73 trillion naira. This includes gross revenue of 63 government-owned enterprises that is proposed at 3.48 trillion. Of this, the federal government oil revenue share is projected to be 1.92 trillion. While non-oil taxes are estimated at 2.43 trillion, and federal government independent revenues are projected to be at 2.21 trillion. Other revenues totaling 768 billion are also projected in the revenue. The government-owned enterprises are projected to remit 1.06 trillion to FGN's Consolidated Revenue Fund and retain 2.42 trillion for their expenditures as well as their reserves. In aggregate, 20% of the projected revenue is expected from oil-related sources, while 80% will be earned from non-oil sources. So this, again, is emphasizing part of the progress that the DG has reported earlier on, what we have been able to achieve in terms of turning our revenue performance from oil to non-oil. When we started, the first budget that we did, 2015, was 70% oil revenue and 30% non-oil revenue. So today, we're at 20% oil revenue and 80% non-oil revenue. And it has been a long journey. Some of the things that have been achieved have been earlier on enumerated by the DG budget. The 2022 aggregate federal government expenditure, inclusive of government-owned enterprises and project-tied loans, is projected to be 20.51 trillion naira. And this is 18.4% higher than the amended 2022 budget. The recurrent non-debt spending estimated to amount to, so this is salaries and pensions, is estimated to be at 8.49 trillion, inclusive of 20 billion social investment fund. The aggregate capital expenditure of 5.34 trillion is 26% of the total expenditure. This is below our set target of 30%, but this 26% also includes the capital expenditure component of the statutory transfers, agencies such as the, arms of government such as the National Assembly, as well as the judiciary, government-owned enterprises capital expenditure, as well as project-tied loan disbursements that are projected to be to be done in 2023. At 6.31 trillion, debt service is 30.8% of total expenditure. This is 71.2% higher than the 2022 estimate, as it includes interest of 1.1 trillion for the Ways and Means from the Central Bank of Nigeria. Overall, the budget deficit is 10.78 trillion for 2023, and this represents 4.78% of GDP. Again, this is higher than the 3% that is set by the Fiscal Responsibility Act. But the same Fiscal Responsibility Act has allowed the President to increase the 3% to GDP threshold if, in the opinion of the President, that the economy is going through through an emergency. The budget deficit is to be financed mainly by domestic borrowing as well as foreign borrowing. Domestic borrowing at 7.04 trillion, while foreign borrowing is at 1.76 trillion. Multilateral and bilateral loans already secured and being implemented, the drawdowns from these loans will be 1.77 trillion. Proceeds from privatization will be 206.18 billion naira. As envisaged by law, there is a continuous need to exceed the threshold, considering the existential issues of security challenges facing the country today. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to speak to you briefly about debt management. Nigeria's public debt maturity profile is within the limits set by the debt management strategy. The debt management strategy is a medium-term strategy that is undertaken and approved by the Debt Management Board as well as the Federal Executive Council. The total debt portfolio of our country today is at $102 billion US. That is both domestic and I don't know if this is clear. Next slide, please. I'm at slide number 26. Okay. It's at $102 billion US. Of this debt, the total debt size of Nigeria. Okay, thank you very much. Of the total debt size, 35% is foreign, 65% is domestic. Of the foreign debt, 48% of our foreign debt is multilateral loans, that is loans from concessionary sources such as the World Bank, the African Development Bank, loans that you get at tenors of 25 years, interest rate of 1.5% or 1.25%, 5 to 7 years moratorium. So we have 48% of our debts in that stock. Then we have the bilateral loans, so loans from China, from Japan, from France, and such like at 12% of the foreign debt stock, while the commercial loans, that is the debt that we raise, euro bonds in the international capital market, are at 39%. So the majority of Nigeria's debt is domestic debt. And this limits our foreign exchange differential exposure. We've also worked over time under the debt management strategy to rebalance our portfolio to longer tenured loans as opposed to shorter tenured loans. And this means we're able to stretch out our repayment obligations to give the country better fiscal room. That is 25%. And we have got approval by His Excellency the President to include the borrowing from the central bank ways and means. Even when we add that, the debt stock will be at 35%. We have set for 40% of GDP. What the Brentwood institutions, as the World Bank and the IMF, projects for countries like Nigeria as healthy is borrowing levels of 55% of GDP. And I must say that most of our comparators are way above this. Some are at 70%, some are close to 100%. So we have been very prudent in terms of the borrowing, trying to stay within the limits set by the debt management strategy. Today, the total public debt as a percentage of GDP stands at 23.06% as of June 2022. And this again is within the threshold of 55% set by the World Bank and the IMF, but it's also within the limits that we have set ourselves, which is 40% in our debt management strategy. And even when we include the ways and means, it will also not be more than 35%. The exposure of the total debt portfolio to manage our exchange rate remains moderate, as the share of domestic debt in the public and to the total public debt comprises 60%. The targeted ratio in our medium-term plan is 70-30, but we're at 70-40, which means we still have room to further borrow more locally and less internationally. The exposure to refinancing risk remains stable, and as a result of the strategy of the issuance of long-dated instruments in the domestic and international markets, adding to longer-term funds from multilateral and bilateral loans, we have been able to, in the last Eurobond issue instruments of up to 30 years, even in the international capital market. And also in the domestic market, we have been issuing long-tenured loans, and they have been very popular in terms of uptake, especially by long-standing investors like pension funds. We also have introduced a safeguard for ourselves that guarantees that federal government gives for any financing, for any investment in Nigeria, should be a maximum of 5% of GDP. Today, what we have been able to attain is 2.64%. So we're still within very healthy thresholds in all of the parameters that are key to ensure debt sustainability. The federal government's contingent liability, so this guarantees that we issued they might not be direct borrowing by government, but because we give the guarantee, it becomes a contingent liability for us, is at 2.6% as at 2022. And Nigeria is, 2021, I beg your pardon, Nigeria is not planning on restructuring its debt, as it remains within healthy limits, and also we remain committed to meeting our domestic obligations. Let me say that debt is provided for in our annual, debt service is provided for in our annual appropriations. And also in terms of disbursement of funds, it is a first-line charge. So that is how we've been able to continuously ensure that we meet our domestic as well as foreign debt service obligations. The federal government will continue to utilize appropriate debt management tools to streamline the cost and the risk profile in the debt portfolio, including leaning more on concessionary loans, spreading out of maturities to avoid bunching so that you don't have too many instruments maturing at any particular point in time, and also reprofiling the maturities by refinancing short-term loans to long-term debt instruments. Ladies and gentlemen, let me just report on what we're doing to drive revenues. Because as I said earlier on, our debts are within healthy limits. The problem we have is in the revenue side, because our debt service to revenue is putting a lot of pressures on the operations of government. So we have these strategic revenue growth initiatives, which is a suite of initiatives that has been designed to maximize the revenue potential in our country, to move our revenue to GDP ratio to 15%. So on tax revenues, non-oil revenues remain more stable than oil revenues, and we have proven that over and over again. To improve non-oil revenues, receipts for from taxes have improved, and efforts will be sustained to expand the non-oil revenues. In addition, the tax system will be further strengthened over the medium term by improving efficiency in collection, enhancing compliance, and reorganizing the business practices of the revenue agencies, as well as employing appropriate technology. Further efforts also will be brought to bring more businesses and the informal sector into the tax net. On customs revenue, in the medium term, the Nigerian Customs Service will introduce frameworks for recovering duties and other fees as appropriate from transactions conducted over electronic networks. The federal government will also further enhance ports efficiency, strengthening anti-smuggling measures, as well as review tariffs and waivers and issue more licenses to build more and newer modern port terminals within existing ports and also new ports outside of Lagos. Independent revenues of federal government have hit over the 1 trillion naira mark in 2021, and this is a process that will continue. To further enhance independent revenue generation, we will continue to maximize the huge potentials and optimize the operational and collection efficiencies of the government-owned enterprises. In many countries, GOEs operate very efficiently and generate significant revenues to fund government budgets. Exempt laws limiting cost to revenue ratio to a maximum of 50% has been enacted and are being enforced from the Finance Act 2020. Technology and ICT solutions will be effectively deployed to ensure compliance and enhance existing and new revenue streams. The performance of GOEs will also be further enhanced by more effective implementation of the approved performance management framework. For the past 3 years, we have developed a practice of enacting finance acts to support the implementation of the annual budgets. We are working and we are at the final stage of the Finance Act 2022. Yesterday, we held a stakeholder consultation, and in the next couple of days, we should be holding more consultations and going for approvals at FEC and then submit, as directed by Mr. President, the Finance Bill 2022 to the National Assembly. So the indicated policy focus for the next finance bill it will be the final Finance Act of this administration, and we hope that subsequent administrations will continue with this practice of enacting finance acts. Given the current state of the polity, it is important to focus this time around on critical macro fiscal reforms to spur vital investments in healthcare, in climate change, as well as in green growth. Fiscal reforms are also will be included in the finance bill to spur job creation for youths, for women, and for small and medium enterprises. Long overdue tax reform incentives will be pivotal in this Finance Act. We are looking at introducing incentives for modern and new economics, and also reducing the incentives for matured sectors. So in the healthcare sector, there are a number of incentives that we have already identified. In the climate change sector, there are a number of incentives like the completion of the non-fiscal reforms to reduce greenhouse emissions, facilitating domestic and international investments in climate adaptation and mitigation. In the healthcare sector, the improvement in the ease of doing business and other reforms to support investment in the health sector as well as in health infrastructure, complement quality healthcare and insurance and other systemic reforms, as well as facilitate domestic and international investments in quality healthcare infrastructure and healthcare systems. Reforming tax incentives. We're looking at phasing out antiquated, pioneer, and other tax incentives for mature industries. Through economic governance reforms, we're going to reduce some of the tax expenditures and revenues that we have been foregoing to support the fiscal situation. And based on statistics, we are going to gradually transition away from expensive and redundant tax incentives. To support job creation and economic growth, we are looking at, again, further refinement of the ease of doing business, specifically to support micro, small, medium enterprises and enterprises for youth and women-owned businesses, with specific focus on fintech, ICT, entertainment, fashion, sports, arts, and such like. We are also looking at restructuring the NYSC to be able to support a diaspora scheme that is being considered relating to NYSC, to create jobs as well as to facilitate inbound capital and investments into the economy from the diasporas. On tax administration and other fiscal reforms, again, further refinement on the ease of doing business and other reforms that will enhance our tax administration, but also introduction of targeted fiscal and non-fiscal reforms to amend, address, and cure defects in existing tax and non-tax laws and regulations, and also curtailing some of the reliefs that we have had to provide during the COVID-19 pandemic. Because reliefs that are provided by government should be targeted and should be time-bound. They shouldn't be existing on an unlimited basis. So there are several options that we're looking at, and like I said, even yesterday, we had public consultation, and after each consultation, we review what is planned and adjust on the go. We also have to consult with the National Assembly. We are also trying to make sure that we're linking the finance bill to not just the national budget, but also to the national plan, to be able to meet those medium-term targets as set in the National Development Plan. Let me just report on some of the critical sectoral allocations in the 2023 budget, and the details, again, will be posted on the website of the Federal Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning, as well as the Budget Office of the Federation. So for the education sector, there's an aggregate provision of 2.05 trillion, and this represents 10% of the federal government's budget. This 2.05 trillion includes 1.23 trillion for the ministry and its agencies, both recurrent and capital, 95.0 billion for the universal basic education UBEC, and then 248.27 billion for TET fund, while we have provided 470 billion for tertiary education revitalization as well as salary enhancements. For the health sector, we have provided 1.58 trillion, and this represents 8% of the federal government's budget. Of this 1.58 trillion, 1.41 trillion is the amount provided for the ministry itself and its agencies, recurrent and capital, but also 69.75 billion for the Gavi immunization counterpart funding, as well as other donor products that require support that require counterpart funding, We also have provided 47.65 billion transfer for the Basic Healthcare Provision Fund. This is 1% of the Consolidated Revenue Fund. Other allocations include the allocations to the defense and security sector, 2.74 trillion. This is 13% of the budget. The amount provision includes the amount provided for the military, for the police, for the intelligence agency, as well as the paramilitary agencies. That's both recurrent and capital. Provisions for infrastructure is 998.93 billion, representing 5% of the budget. And this includes provisions for works and housing, power, transport, water resources, and aviation. Provisions made for the social development and poverty reduction, 756 billion, representing 4% of the budget. This amount is provided for the National Social Investment Program as well as the National Poverty Reduction and Growth Strategy programs. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, the draft 2023 budget has been prepared against a backdrop of continued global challenges occasioned by the lingering COVID-19 pandemic, as well as higher food and fuel prices due to the war in Ukraine. The overall fiscal risks are somewhat elevated, following weaker than expected domestic economic performance and structural issues in the domestic economy. Early passage of the budget for implementation by the 1st of January will significantly contribute towards completion of legacy projects of this administration, as well as enhanced smooth transition and achievements of government macro-fiscal and sectoral objectives. Revenue generation remains the major fiscal constraint of the Federation, and therefore this budget and the plan is paying special attention to revenue. The systemic resource mobilization problem has been compounded by the past two recessions that we had faced, but we will continue to focus on aggressive revenue drive. Efforts will also, however, focus on improved tax administration as well as collection efficiency. Crude oil production challenges and PMS subsidy deductions by the NMPC constitute a very significant threat to the achievements of our revenue growth targets as seen in the 2022 performance up to August. Collectively, we must take bold, decisive, and very, very urgent action to urgently address the revenue underperformance and expenditure efficiency at both national as well as subnational levels. However, our government remains mindful of the need to provide safety nets to cushion the impact of the reform measures on the vulnerable segments of our population. The goal of the fiscal interventions will be carried on to further stimulate the economy through carefully calibrated regulatory policy measures that will be designed to boost domestic value addition, to de-risk enterprise environment, to attract external investments, and also to improve our source of funding. We welcome citizens' participation in enhancing budget implementation and monitoring via the following platforms, as you can see in the screen, the iMonitor, as well as the Citizens Budget Monitoring app that will be available on Google Store. And details of the 2023 budget proposals will be available on the website of the Budget Office of the Federation, as well as the website of the Federal Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your attention.
An incisive presentation such as that deserves a better round of applause, please.
Mr. President stated that the Honorable Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning will be providing further details thereof. And that is essentially why we are gathered here today. Expectedly, you have had a chance of interrogating the 2023 budget proposal since Mr. President laid it before the National Assembly. I note that the 2023 budget proposal has generated already significant public interest, as reflected in the several public discussions and articles on the 2023 budget proposals. We therefore look forward to a robust engagement on the subject today. We are normally very reticent about the improvements we have brought to bear on the FGN budget process over the past 6 years, but I'll break with that tradition today, albeit briefly. And the said improvements include the following. One, significantly enhanced use of technology in the budget process, including service-wide implementation of the GIFMIS budget preparation system. This has minimized errors in the budget and facilitated timely passage of the budget, thus enabling a sustained return to a predictable January to December fiscal year. In this regard, of course, we have enjoyed strong cooperation from the National Assembly. Two, in a bid to enhance budget comprehensiveness and transparency, the FGN's budget now includes all projects funded by bilateral/multilateral loans, donor-funded programs/projects, as well as the revenues and expenditures of 63 major government-owned enterprises/regulatory agencies. Three, enhanced and timely availability of budget-related information to the public through the Budget Office and Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning websites, as well as responsiveness to freedom of information requests. This has facilitated greater public participation in the budget process. Number four, strategic refocusing of the budget to the revenue side thereof, rather than a mere statement of expenditure proposals. This led to a redesign of the appropriation bill to include both revenue and expenditure estimates, and has contributed to the substantial growth in non-oil revenue performance recorded. A new performance management framework for government-owned enterprises was introduced to support this effort. Number five, 3 years ago, we introduced the enactment of annual finance acts to keep our fiscal policies/laws up to date and support the implementation of the annual budgets. This was the first time since the return to democratic governance in 1999. These improvements have been validated by the significant improvements in FGN's public expenditure and fiscal accountability review ratings by the World Bank. Nigeria's 2021 Open Budget Index scores on fiscal transparency and accountability also reflected significant improvements, with Nigeria ranked among the top 2 reformers. We nevertheless keep striving for continuous improvements in the FGN budget process. For instance, we will shortly be launching the National Budget Portal that will be a one-stop access point for information about the budgets of the federal, state, and local governments. And this will enable more accurate reports about Nigeria's national expenditure on key sectors like health and education. In the interest of time, let me pause at this point and once again say welcome to the ministerial presentation of the 2023 Executive Budget Proposal. Thank you for your attention.